All right, folks, we're a couple of minutes after 10 after, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'll open us up in prayer, and then we'll jump into our study. Father in heaven, thank you again for this opportunity that we get to come together and gather as a body of believers here in this place in Keller at Bear Creek Bible Church to just love you and to remind ourselves how much we are loved by you and what it cost you to make us a part of the family of God. We thank you that that is the opportunity that we have unmolested to be able to come in this way when we think about other areas of the world where this is not a freedom that people can enjoy freely. So we thank you for the fact that we can do that here. And we thank you that we also have the opportunity here in this church to go through these classes and the opportunities that we have to learn more about you through your word. And then in this case, a class where we get to learn about you, more about you through history and the way that you've influenced men and women who had a say, especially for this class, when we look at the presidents of this country as it's getting ready to celebrate its 250th anniversary. So we thank you, Lord. We ask that you bless our time together, bless our conversation as we look through the life of Thomas Jefferson as well as his presidency. Allow what we talk about today to be the words that you would want us to hear and to walk away with. And so we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so as mentioned, we've been going through this class for the last 3 weeks now. This is actually week 3. So we are going to be touching on Thomas Jefferson, but I just wanted to keep putting this up here because in case you're looking for where the source material is coming from, it's primarily from this book, which is right here. I think they sell it in the front if you're interested. I can't recommend the 2-volume series enough. Like, this is just a phenomenal book put together, chock full of resources. Everything is footnoted and backed by actual documentation, so nothing is being mentioned as hearsay. It's all being mentioned as purely sourced information. And then I'm uploading all these classes because there's just a lot of interest. And so thank you for those of you who have been doing it, who have been subscribing and watching. I appreciate that. But it's primarily just to get the opportunity for folks who can't see this class, who have asked me about it, to be able to watch it. So I'm trying dutifully to put these up the Sunday evenings that these classes happen. I'm trying to get them up the same day. So with that being said, we're going to be diving into Thomas Jefferson today. So Thomas Jefferson would become our 3rd president. So Thomas Jefferson would be born in 1743 in rural Virginia. He would grow up in a place called Albemarle County. And it was a home, at the time, it was home to a lot of Indian tribes. And so it was interesting because for Jefferson, his father, who was Peter Jefferson, his mom was Jane Randolph, history tells us that Peter was a massive individual, like a massive man. Like, you know, you think about like Paul Bunyan type stuff, like that's kind of how Thomas Jefferson's dad, Peter, was referred to. So Peter made the conscious decision to take the family and actually move them into this rural area, knowing that they were going to be around a number of hostile Native American tribes that were around. To Peter's credit, he had already served in the local militia in Virginia in the colonies, and so, you know, serving with the British under the British authority. So that, plus being a large man, he was very, you know, suited to being an outdoorsman and being able to protect his family as well as being out there. And so interestingly enough, what would happen is Peter would actually develop a pretty strong relationship with the actual local tribes in the area, so much so that Jefferson would write in his memoirs that he would recall multiple times as a young man and as a teenager, local Indian chiefs coming to the house and like breaking bread with his dad and just visiting with the family and just having that relationship. So they were not hostile to the Native American tribes that were there. They wanted to live alongside with them and coexist with them. And so history supports the fact that that is what happened. The only time that there were any hostilities would have been when, during the French Indian War and others, where Thomas Jefferson's dad, Peter, would actually serve and fight alongside the French as well as with the British when it came to defending against the hostile Indian tribes. And so the reason that this is important is because given that backdrop of where he's growing up, his father understood, because his father wasn't a man of a lot of means. He was a man of meager means, but he understood how important it was for his children to be educated. And so the primary focus that he had for his kids is like, oh, I want all of them to be educated. And he saw a lot of promise in his son Thomas, and so he wanted to make sure that that was the case. And so ultimately what he would end up doing, and if you're familiar with Monticello is the famous estate that Jefferson would end up building in this county. It still stands today. It's a historical site. You can go check it out. He was so enamored with this area that when he went to build his home, that's where he ended up building it. He would build Monticello there. And so at the age of 14, he would begin to receive what was called a classical education. It's still somewhat available today. It's not as popular for reasons I'm going to explain. But this was arguably the best type of education you could receive because it was so well-rounded. And because of this education that Thomas would receive at this age and going through all this stuff, you'll start to see how much of an influence it has as he grows up into his early career and into the presidency. So when we think about a classical education during this time, it would have included the study of classical literature, foreign languages, world civilization, government, civics, the Bible, athletics, weaponry, military planning and tactics, humanities, physical science, morality, world history, fine arts, geography, mathematics, natural science, oratory, rhetoric, music, logic, reasoning, and debate, and memorization and recitation. All of that was part of the classical education curriculum. Now, they don't do that anymore, right? You don't typically find that. I mean, one of the biggest arguments that, not arguments, but points of contention, I'll say it that way, that I'll have when I chat with people is like most of the newer, this younger generation that's coming up does not possess critical thinking skills that come from a background in this type of education, right? They're being spoon-fed information, they're not being challenged on it, and then they're not able to create a position from which to be able to either defend or support. I mean, that's the whole concept behind critical thinking. And so it's unfortunate because I'm a little bit of a rabbit trail here, but I believe the doctor's name was a PhD, I think Dr. Horvath, I don't know his first name, but he was testifying in front of Congress, and he was saying that we're in a situation where for the first time in recorded history, that the next generation is actually going to be dumber than the previous generation. They're actually going to have an IQ that's lower than the previous generation. And it's primarily attributed to the fact of the movement away from a critical education-based focus to an education technology-based focus, which took the onus off of the individuals to struggle through, some tough work. So think about the books that you actually physically had to read, right, when you were in school. You don't get that now. They give them laptops, they're giving snippets, they don't have the whole book. They get an idea. They're literally encouraging Cliff Notes, which is something that we looked for when we were in college to help us with books, right? Right? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But you still knew the material. Like you knew the book, you just needed a Cliff Notes just to help you when you got to the test. It was like, okay, just so I can organize this. Yeah, they can't write a book report. There's a lot of things that you see. So this is so important because you think about education today, and it's, again, the data's all out there. You can look at how poorly education has gone in the United States once it became a department in the government. That's all I'm going to say about that. Just look for the numbers yourself. And the correlation is it does not matter how much money you've thrown at this, the results have not followed, right? And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we've gotten away from this idea of education, classical education, because narratives are easier to support when you don't have a foundation from which to challenge it, right? So that classical education would become important because as he's going through this, he would become an avid learner, a lifelong learner, would love to learn and read. It was just something that this is what he enjoyed. Like you have those friends where the highlight of their day is having like a book, right? That was Jefferson. Jefferson would just love to read. He would study, he was a sponge for this stuff. Ultimately, he gravitates towards law, no surprise, just like John Adams did, gravitates towards law and becomes a lawyer. Unlike John Adams, he wouldn't be a practicing lawyer in the way that Adams was. He would practice a little bit, but it wouldn't be something that he would do all the time. It was something that he was very, very interested in. But his background as a lawyer will come into play as we think about his role in the founding documents as well as into the presidency. And so after becoming a lawyer, he would enter what was called he would be elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses. So that was during the colonial era. So this was established in 1619 Jamestown, where it was the first elected body of actual individuals that actually had a voice in the civil affairs of the colony. And so the British Empire was fine with it. And so it was akin to what you would see of like the House of Representatives today. The House of Burgesses had two levels, right? That was made up of different things. And so it was basically a primer for what we eventually would have as the House of Representatives. So he gets elected to go into the VA House of Burgesses. And what's interesting, as soon as he gets elected, right, because he's been seeing what's been going on, because this is all around the time that the hostilities with Britain are starting to percolate to the surface. And in 1774, what he would do is he would help organize activities in Virginia to help support other colonies that were under British oppression. Now, the reason that date's important is because of an event that happens in 1773. Any ideas of what major event happens in 1773 that starts to spur on the thoughts of having independence? Well-known event. Boston Tea Party, who said it? Yes, the Boston Tea Party would happen in 1773. 1773, the Boston Tea Party happens, first real form of colonial protest, right? Now, what do the British do? The British, in their response, they would pass what's called the Boston Port Bill. They would blockade the Boston Harbor with the hopes of financially crippling what they viewed as insurgents against the British Empire, right? Jefferson learns about this, and he's like, okay, well, this is not right. Like, why are we doing this? And so what he actually ends up advocating for is he introduces a measure in the VA House, and he says that we should call for a public day of fasting and prayer to intercede for God's help for their brethren in Massachusetts. Jefferson, who's commonly referred to as the most non-religious founder, the separation of church and state guy, right, is calling for a public day of fasting and prayer, asking for the interceding of God on behalf of their brethren in Massachusetts, right? Not only that, he would go and urge local churches around Monticello to arrange a parallel day of prayer and worship, encouraging them, and I quote, to devoutly implore the divine interposition in behalf of an injured and oppressed people. Right? But no, we're not allowed to pray today, right? But my point is, this was stuff that Jefferson was doing. That same year, and this is what would really start to elevate his star a bit, he would write a document called A Summary View of the Rights of British America. And now he was writing this specifically for the delegates that Virginia was sending to the Continental Congress. But because people started to read him like, this is really good stuff, because it laid out a lot of the grievances and the same ideas that would ultimately appear in the Declaration of Independence, they actually printed it and sent it all throughout the colonies. So all the rest of the colonies started to get a taste of Jefferson through this paper that he wrote for the VA delegates, right? And so what we end up finding is that after this, right, he would get, as part of the Continental Congress, right, he would get placed in 1776, he would be placed on the Committee of Five, selected to draft the Declaration of Independence. And this is important because most of what Jefferson proposes for the Declaration of Independence is supported and approved by the Committee of Five. Roughly 80% of the contents of the Declaration of Independence were penned by Jefferson, including the most famous line in the opening statement of the Declaration, right? Which says, we hold that these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That was penned by Jefferson and kept in whole cloth in the Declaration of Independence. And so, again, this idea that somehow Jefferson was this either agnostic or atheistic individual that did not believe in God is not supported by the facts. He's including these in the founding documents called the Charters of Freedom, right? The combination of the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, all of which had that influence, right? That same year, in what he would do, not that same year, but in 17, it would actually be introduced the following year. So in 1777, back in the VA House of Burgess, he would introduce what's called the Statute of Religious Freedom. And the reason that this is important is because during the time of the colonies, the major church was the Church of England, right? And so the Church of England was adopted by most of the colonies as the state church. However, King Henry VIII would establish the Anglican Church, right? And so what would end up happening is that some of the colonies would say, okay, instead of the Church of England, we're going to align ourselves with the Anglican Church. That's what happened in Virginia. In Virginia, the state church became the Anglican Church. Well, just like what was happening in Britain, right? Those who were not members of the Church of England would get harassed, would be jailed, would be beaten, would be treated poorly. Same thing started to happen in Virginia. The Anglicans in Virginia that had power, supported by the state, started to go after the other denominations. Anyone who wasn't a practicing Anglican. They would be jailed, they would be beaten, they would be whipped and all sorts of other stuff, right? And Jefferson, along with other Virginians, strongly disagreed with this perspective. And so he introduces this statute, right, with the goal of putting all denominations on equal footing. So what would end up happening is that in 1786, it would finally be passed and would officially end the Anglican state church in Virginia and actually open up the state of Virginia to free religious expression for any denomination in that colony and ultimately in that state. the following 2 years later, in 1779, he would actually become governor of Virginia. So this statute of religious freedom, keep that in mind, because you're going to see this principle that Jefferson has of this idea of there being equality amongst us when it comes to religious expression, and that we should not elevate one religious expression over the other, but that the idea that we're all meant to be able to be free in our expression of religious liberty. And so he's doing all of this, becomes governor, right? And now, remember from last week when we talked about, the election of 1800. And so the ugliness of the election between Adams and Jefferson, right? And all the mudslinging, all the craziness that was happening. To Jefferson's credit, after he wins, what he wants to do as the third president, he wants to bring the nation together. Remember, he served with Washington. He was very familiar with the 4 pillars that Washington had laid out. And so the idea of the most important pillar, pillar 1 that Washington had, was preserving the national unity, right? And so what Jefferson did in his inaugural address was he sought to bring everyone together. He wanted to say that, and he says this in his inauguration speech, he says, every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. In this context, he's saying anti-federalists, and then we are all Federalists, right? The idea of saying that regardless of where your ideology may be, at the end of the day, we are all one people, and we should be able to peacefully coexist as a people and not elevate our ideology to our identity. Our identity is the people of America. It's not to our ideology. He would further acknowledge in his opening statement in the address, he would say, he would acknowledge an adoring and overruling providence, right? So again, as far as Jefferson was concerned, his clear belief as he opened up the inaugural address as president was his belief in God, putting him first, and God's influence on the prosperity of the nation, right? And now this isn't surprising, because Jefferson in his other writings, especially when it came to crafting the founding documents of the country, Jefferson's view of Christianity is not disputed. And so here's what he would actually write when he was putting together his perspective on what made the most sense as the moral framework for the founding documents of the country. He say this, because I should take a general view of the moral doctrines of the most remarkable of the ancient philosophers of whose ethics we have sufficient information to make an estimate. Say Pythagoras, Epicurus, Epicletus, Socrates, Cicero, Seneca, Antonius. I should do justice to the branches of morality they have treated well, but point out the importance of those in which they are deficient. I should then proceed to a view of the life, character, and doctrines of Jesus. His system of morality was the most benevolent and sublime probably that has been ever taught, and consequently more perfect than those of any of the ancient philosophers. This is Jefferson writing on the influence of Jesus Christ, Christianity, and the Bible on why it was the perfect foundation on which to frame the founding documents of the nation. So again, when you think about Jefferson as president, he serves as Secretary of State first under Washington, right? Then he serves as vice president through Adams' term, right? And then he'll become the third president of the United States in 1801. And so as he becomes president, right, I want to touch, I'm going to spend a lot of time on this section only because it's important, because it has a lot to do with a lot of stuff that we see today. And so I mentioned this Supreme Court decision last week, Marbury versus Madison. Now, to give you a little bit of that backstory again from last week, very quickly, right? We talked about what happened when Adams and his Federalist Party lost, right? Not only did they lose the presidency, they lost both houses of Congress, right? They lost the House of Representatives and they lost the Senate. So being locked out of the executive, being locked out of the legislative, they said, okay, well, the third branch is the judiciary, so we're going to try and consolidate power in the judiciary. And that's exactly what Adams ended up doing. He passes the Judiciary Act of 1801 to expand the federal judiciary, then passes another law for the District of Columbia, right? And all throughout this time, he's putting Federalists in these positions because they want to control all the judgeships, right? They want to limit and hamstring the effectiveness of Jefferson. And so what ends up happening, though, is the very last appointments, right, especially for that law that was passed for the District of Columbia, they don't deliver all of these appointments, right? Now they're signed and they're sealed, so they're signed by Adams and they have the seal of the United States on the documents, but they're not delivered. Jefferson, after taking office on his first day, James Madison, his Secretary of State, finds the undelivered commissions, hands them to Jefferson. Jefferson is under no obligation to deliver them, still opts to deliver some of them, not all of them. because he says that 42, which was the number of judges that were part of the District of Columbia Act, was way too many, right? So one of the people who didn't receive their appointment was a gentleman by the name of William Marbury. He was one of the 17 who didn't receive his appointments. And so he, along with 3 others, would sue the government. They would sue James Madison and the government, demanding that they deliver the signed letter from Adams, right? Now, the interesting thing is, unlike cases today, right, where you start in your local court and makes its way up to the district courts, and then if it doesn't get there, you can appeal to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, can choose to hear or not hear, right? That's based in Article 3 of the Constitution. Now, in this case, Marbury goes right to the Supreme Court, right? Because they didn't have, all this judiciary didn't exist yet, right? So the only major court that we had was the Supreme Court. Now, this is where things get interesting, right? Because at the time, Adams' Secretary of State was John Marshall. John Marshall then gets placed as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court as one of Adams' acts during this whole process. So he's Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, in a normal set of circumstances, you clearly have a conflict of interest, and you would recuse yourself from the case. That's not what happened here. John Marshall would hear the case. So John Marshall will hear the case, right? And he rules, unsurprisingly, that Marbury has a right to his appointment. But the key thing that Marshall points out in this decision is that the Supreme Court doesn't have the power to compel Jefferson to do it. Let that stick in, okay? Let that stick in. So he says that Marbury should have a right to his appointment, but that the Supreme Court has no means to force Jefferson to deliver it. Well, how does he get there, right? Well, we go back to the Judiciary Act of 1798. This was passed during the Washington presidency, right? And so what that said was it laid out what the courts were able to do. Interestingly enough, one of the sections in the Judiciary Act, Section 13, says that the Supreme Court had the right to issue what's called a writ of Mirandus to wherever as part of that Judiciary Act. Well, Marshall, in viewing that act, he's like, wait, that was an act that was passed by Congress. But the Constitution in Article 3 says the Supreme Court doesn't have the ability to do that. So since the Constitution is the governing document of the land and all other laws that come out of it have to be measured against the Constitution, he finds that that section in that law is unconstitutional. He says it's giving the Supreme Court additional powers that are not given to it by the Constitution. So what Marshall is doing is he finds a constitutional conflict and says, okay, because there's a constitutional conflict, the Constitution is the supreme document, therefore the Constitution wins. That's why the Supreme Court does not have the means to deliver this, because the power in and of itself is unconstitutional because we are not granted to it by the Constitution per Article 3. Still with me? Okay, because man, I had to read this so many times to make sense of this. And I'm like, wait, like help me out. Like I walked through so many different things, so many articles, and finally got there, right? And now, this is where it gets really bizarre, right? So what Marshall's doing is eventually what is considered judicial review, which is the purview of the third branch of government. That's what they're supposed to do. It's this idea that they don't have power like the executive and the legislative branches. What they do have is the power to exercise judgment over whether the Constitution is being followed by those two branches. They don't have the power, however, to compel the other branches to do something. They are telling the branches, like, hey, you are operating outside the confines of the Constitution. Ergo, the proper response becomes, okay, well, if the Supreme Court has just called that this is actually a strike and we need to change, then the legislative has to go back, fix the law, which then goes to the executive, the president, to then sign said law, right? That's how it's supposed to operate. You go back to the Federalist Papers. This was laid out brilliantly by the founders in the Federalist Papers. This is what they talked about. And so this was an operating principle that was in adoption even before the foundation, before the forming of the actual Constitution. This was a principle that was very well aware to Hamilton, to Adams, and others when it came to the proper role of the judiciary. Because what would happen is what they saw in the British Empire was the British empires could just create laws out of whole cloth and it didn't matter because they could just do whatever they wanted, right? the writ of appropriations that we were talking about the week before, and all these others, the Boston Blockade Act, like the things that they wanted to do, they just did it, right? They weren't bound by a founding document. Whereas the United States, they understood the importance of having a core cornerstone document that sets the stage for how the country as a whole should operate, especially the three co-equal, and I'm using air quotes on purpose, co-equal branches of government. Now, when we think about this from the terms of the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary, I feel like I'm like in history class right now, but we've been told that all three branches are equal, and that is true in terms of they are a form of checks and defenses against other branches. Because in the Federalist Papers, right, what you'll find is that they all feared that since the legislative had the power to create laws and they were closest to the people, they were actually the branch to be feared the most because they could just pass laws. And so if the other branches didn't have a means, so in the executive, veto power, right? In the judiciary, the ability to call balls and strikes on whether those laws are actually in conformance with the Constitution, they understood the wisdom of having a system that allowed the branches to check one another to make sure that neither branch had unfettered access to do things that were out of bounds with the Constitution. Now, most normal folks will say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? But what have we found today? Well, in the 60s, what ended up happening was you had a whole slew of liberal and progressive judicial activists that dug up this decision because they found that, wait, Marshall declared a law unconstitutional. So they moved away from this concept of judicial review to the concept of judicial supremacy, which said that no, the Supreme Court not only tells us what the law is, it now binds that interpretation on all parties. And so they would encourage judges during this time period to say, hey, if you see something that you don't like, because the other thing that the Federalist Papers laid out was that the whole point of the judiciary was that it was never meant to have a political will. Meaning, when it's examining a law, it has to examine a law on the merits of the law, not on the merits of the political will behind the law. Basically, the whole idea of like justice being blind, like blindfold with the scales, is the idea of you're looking at the merits of how it has been put forward. The rules, the mandates, whatever has been put forward in a law, does it conform with what is expected in the Constitution? That's the idea. It's not meant to have a political will to say, well, I don't like the person who put this law forward, ergo I'm going to rule against it. That was the idea that Jefferson and others were very cautious against. Hamilton wrote vociferously against it. And so what they ended up with doing was they found a means in this decision to strike down laws, to encourage judges to strike down laws which they disagreed with, and in many cases, create new ones, right? We've seen this multiple times with the Supreme Court over the last 20 years. Just think about major decisions that have come out from the Supreme Court where they essentially created law, which was not their purview. But because of the revisionist history of changing the perspective of the Marbury decision to be one of judicial review to one of judicial supremacy, it ceded the authority that the three co-equal branches were supposed to have and created even more power in the judiciary, especially at the Supreme Court, to do these things. And it wasn't just the Supreme Court who did these things. You could go into the district level courts and the appeals courts where you would find instances today, like this is the only time I'm going to get political, where the current president is not liked by a majority of people in power, right? And so you have judges who have a particular political leaning who are leveraging Marbury to say that certain decisions are unconstitutional. They're not saying that they're unconstitutional on the merits of the law, because in almost every case they get appealed and they lose, right? But the fact is, it shouldn't even be going to that point. The fact that they're leveraging Marbury to execute these kinds of decisions is ridiculous, right? And they won't come out and say it, right? They're not going to tell you that they're leveraging, this particular seed that was planted by Marshall in this decision, unless you actually dig in the history and see what Marshall was doing. Marshall, even in his opinion, writes, what I have before me is to say, is this law in conformance with the Constitution? I am here to say whether this is the law or not. That's all he was doing. He's saying, based on the merits of what this is, that's what I'm being asked to look at. I'm not being asked to opine on, do I agree with said law or not? I am being asked to opine on whether this law aligns with the Constitution. And that's why Marshall was able to, and again, Scholars on both sides will either call Marshall a genius or a lunatic, because on the one hand, you can make the case that, well, that was brilliant on Marshall's part because he saw a conflict between a power in a law passed by one branch that gave more power to an additional branch, not giving it to it by the main document, which is the Constitution. Whereas another would say, wait, Section 13 in and of itself is technically constitutional if the case that is put before the Supreme Court has gone through the proper channels in line with Article 3, meaning that the Supreme Court could issue a writ of memorandum if that's what the decision required. So depending on how you looked at it, the lunatics would say Marshall created this weird system where he created a constitutional crisis to then come up with this decision. And on the other side, you would say, well, no, based on the merits of what he was looking at on the law, on the merits of the case that Marbury had brought to him, which says, I am demanding the Supreme Court issue a writ of memorandus to Madison to deliver the appointment. So in light of just that, Marshall was absolutely correct in this decision. Marbury could not compel the Supreme Court to do that because it exceeded the authority given to them, because the Supreme Court, per Article 3, was not meant to adjudicate these things unless it had gone through the prior set of courses through other courts, which they had, but they weren't nearly as many. And so the argument ultimately ends up being that had Marbury actually started in a lower court that was available at the time, and then it made its way to the Supreme Court, he wouldn't have declared it unconstitutional, because at that point, the Supreme Court is now operating under its proper authority under both Article 3 in harmony with Section 13 of the Judicial Act, because it is now able to do that because it has gone through the proper channels. Suffice all of that, right? I'm giving you all that backstory because when you get to this idea of judicial review versus judicial supremacy, what's interesting is what Jefferson does as a result of this decision, right? He does what, and this isn't surprising to anyone. Nobody was pissed off about it, right? Nobody protested. Like, no one was upset. The Supreme Court didn't say anything. They were like, yeah, no, that's the proper, course of government. So Jefferson gets the decision, and he ignores it. He ignores the decision. But what he ends up doing is he ends up repealing the very act, the Judicial Act of 1801 that Adams put in, that created this whole nonsense in the first place, which is the proper course of government. They passed a law, the legislative passed it, he signed it. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, we're not arguing with that. That's what it's supposed to happen. And so ergo, Marbury may have won on the spirits of his argument, but Marshall, as Chief Justice, actually protected the role of the judiciary through that. Unfortunately, what has happened today is this has become completely weaponized, and most people don't realize that that's what's happening. And we live under this idea like, oh, well, we're just going to appeal everything to the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter in the land. Like, no, it's not. Like, it is a co-equal branch of government. It's meant to call balls and strikes on whether said laws are in line with the Constitution or not, right? So all of that being said, Jefferson ignores it. They repeal the law, right? And so that's what ends up happening. But typically what we'll see today is that the argument pushed in most cases is, well, let's take it to the Supreme Court because they're the ones that are going to tell everybody else what to do, which is not a proper understanding of how the three branches of government are supposed to work and are a huge departure from the concepts as laid out in both the Federalist Papers and elsewhere in terms of how the founders viewed the three branches of government operating. And so I'm going to pivot a little bit from that case because there's a lot of other stuff that Jefferson did that I need to get to in the time that we have. But I want to highlight this thing that we dealt with. So and this is kind of funny because the idea of having war with the Barbary states, right? So by the time Jefferson is president, right, I got to give you a little bit of backstory before we get here. So after the war, prior to the War of Independence, right, the colonies were under British authority. Right? But even during that time, you had a number of Muslim nations, Muslim majority nations, Turkey, Tunis, Morocco, Algiers, and Tripoli, which is modern day Libya. They would attack any country that they believed were Christian, right? And so they would attack America at the time, so the colonies at the time, England, France, Spain, Portugal, Denmark, Sweden, et cetera, right? And even before this, in the mid-1600s, they would attack the colonies, while we were still a British colony. But because we were under the protection of the British, and the British had a very formidable navy, right? They were like, all right, we're not going to mess with the colonies. And they had a treaty with Britain that said, okay, we're not going to do anything, right? And so these nations were called the Barbary states, the Barbary nations, and they were named, for the ethnic Berber people who were Muslims and largely inhabited the North African regions. Now, in these attacks, they would seize ships and cargo and they would force the crews into slavery. And so naturally what happens after the War of Independence, these nations like, oh, they're not under the protection of Britain anymore, so they are ripe for the picking. And so that's exactly what happened as soon as Washington becomes president. They start attacking again. They start taking the ships and they start taking the cargo and they start putting people into slavery, right? And it was a really profitable practice for these Muslim nations. They would actually make money selling the crews, earning anywhere up to $1 million in today's money for every ship that they seized, right? And so Washington becomes president. The problem is still happening, but we don't have a navy, right? And so we can't go to war. We just can't recover from a war with Britain. We don't have the ability to take on these nations on the sea or even take it to them. And so what we end up doing is we end up paying a tribute to these nations. And the reason I want that Washington went with this, because you got to understand that during this time, they would send, now before Washington became president, during the Continental Congress, this was still going on. And so they actually sent a delegation. They would send Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Ben Franklin to the ambassador in Tripoli, right? And they asked him, like, what would it take, for you to stop doing this? Like, what do we need to do, right? And so I want to read you a quote from the actual minister, right? And then you're going to wonder why the whole modern idea of like the war on terror is not a modern idea, okay? So they go there, they ask him, and this is what he responds. He says that their religion was founded on the laws of their prophet Muhammad, that it was written in their Quran that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, that it was their right and duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise. Foreign ambassador in Tripoli telling Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin, yeah, this is why we're not going to stop. Because we are duty-bound as adherents to this religion, and this is what our religion tells us to do. Sound familiar? So this was happening way back then. And so Washington, again, he recognizes that he can't do anything, right? And so one of the things that he's able to finally do, he's like, okay, they try and pass all these different treaties, nothing's really working, and they basically say, well, if you pay us a tribute, we will not attack you. So that's what Washington ends up doing. And so he starts paying a tribute to these countries. And by the end of Washington's presidency, so by the 8th year, right, of his second term, these payments made up 16% of the total federal budget. Now, this is what drove Washington in his last year to want a navy, right? And he goes, if we just had a navy to protect ourselves, we could stop, because this is ridiculous. We shouldn't be extorted by these countries. And so Adams, as his vice president, and ultimately as president, aggressively goes after creating a navy. We talked about that last week. Part of why he did that was because of what was happening with the French, right? Now you would think that okay, we had success against the French, let's take it to the Barbary states, right, and stop them. Adams doesn't do it. He doesn't want to go to war with them. Why do you think he doesn't want to go to war with them?
He's been declared, he was heavily opposed anyway in voting the Navy in the first place.
Well, that was part of it, but he had already been there and spoke with the ambassador, and he knew exactly how they were going to operate. So he knew this was not going to be a one-and-done thing where they could go and knock it out, and it would be an extended affair. And he knew, on top of what was already happening, that the American people weren't going to support an extended war with another nation. So what does Adams do? He continues to pay this tribute. And so by the end of his presidency, these payments now made up 20% of the federal budget, right? So you get to this point, and Jefferson now becomes president. And Jefferson he's got to figure out what he's going to do. He's got 3 options, right? He says, I can either keep all American ships out of international waters, which would be economic suicide. 2, he could continue paying the extortion money. Or 3, use military force and end the attacks, because this wasn't sustainable. Because if this continues to grow, it's going to end up taking over most, if not all, of the federal budget. So Jefferson, again, being one of the 3 that went there, knew how this was going to play out. he decides, I'm going to choose option 3. We're going to go to war with these states because we can't continue to do this. So he stops making the extortion payments to Tripoli as well as to the other nations, right? So as soon as we stop making the payments to Tripoli, they declare war on us. Algiers threatens to go to war, and then the other nations say, fine, you're not going to pay us, we're just going to start attacking you again. So they start taking more ships, right? And so Jefferson ends up tapping General William Eaton, who had previously served in the War for Independence. But what's interesting about this gentleman is he actually served as an appointed U.S. consul to Tunis by John Adams. So he was in the region, familiar with the people, familiar with the tactics. And so for Jefferson, it made complete sense to tap Eaton to lead the charge in the battle against these nations. And so with the Navy now in hand that he had, Eaton was able to actually transport U.S. Marines overseas to these nations, taking the fight directly to them. This was not something that these nations were expecting. So as soon as American Marines show up on their shores, they stop fighting. In most cases, almost immediately. The only one who doesn't back down is Tripoli. So Tripoli decides that they're going to double down and attack. Like, no, we're not going to take this line down. We're going to attack you. And so Eaton would lead a 4-year effort against Tripoli, freeing every enslaved American that was there and ultimately stopping the military forces in Tripoli. In 1805, Tripoli would actually formally surrender and sign a peace treaty on our terms, as opposed to before when we would have to sign treaties on their terms and pay them extortion money. And so it was a huge accomplishment on Jefferson, and that's why you typically hear in the Battle Hymn of the Republic, "On the shores of Tripoli," right? That's where that comes from. So it's a nod back to wars against these extremist Islamist nations who would do that. And so we've got it in history where this is something that's happened in the past. And so think about some of the narratives that you're seeing today, like, oh, if we just leave them alone, like, it'll be fine. Like, no, like, history tells us that that's not true, because if they are true believers, they are acting out on their belief. And it's not wrong to call that out, right? And so that's the idea. Jefferson knew it then, and Jefferson responded accordingly. Another major accomplishment that Jefferson had was the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Now, this one's interesting because the way that he decides to do this, right, is he sends, during the time, right, of Jefferson, like, everywhere along the Mississippi River is still controlled by the French, right? Now, we don't have hostilities with the French, but it's still their territory. And so for Jefferson, he's like, at some point, we're going to need to be able to expand commerce into the Mississippi River region. So how do we do that? Well, we've got to be able to at least get some of this land. Like, we can't just continue to have this sort of commerce relationship while French controls land in our own country. Like, we've got to do something. So he taps Robert Livingston and James Monroe, who would eventually become the 5th president of the United States. And he tells them, listen, I want you to go to the French leaders and I want you to encourage them to sell us, let's start with one city. Let's start with the city of New Orleans, right? See if they'd be willing to sell that city, right? Because in Jefferson's mind, he wanted all of it, but he knew, in his head, he's like, that's probably not tenable. They're probably not going to go for that, right? And so they go there, and the French are like, yeah, no, we have no interest in selling you anything, right? Let alone New Orleans. And so Livingston, to his credit, he's like, okay, wait. He knows that the French and England still are not on good terms, right? So Livingston tells the French, he's like, if that's the case, then we're probably going to cozy up and get a stronger relationship with England because we're a growing country. We're going to need some more opportunities. So guess who the emperor was at that time in France? Napoleon. Yes, very good. Yeah. So Napoleon's like, hold up, time out. No, I don't want you guys getting closer to England, to our enemies. Let's make a deal, right? And so he starts off with New Orleans, but knowing that the door has been opened, Livingston and Monroe aggressively push on Napoleon. It's like, no, come on. You really don't need this, right? Just let us have this area. So they kept pushing. Ultimately, France agrees to sell 828,000 square miles of land at roughly 3 cents an acre. So that purchase price ends up being $11 million in cash that we would pay to France, and America choosing to dismiss the financial claims that it already had against France, which were worth about $4 million. So all in, approximately $15 million when we think about the purchase. And so when you think about the land that was purchased, it would stretch from the Gulf of Mexico in the south all the way to the border with Canada in the north, with the Mississippi River as the eastern boundary and the Rocky Mountains as the western border. And we would end, out of that territory, we would form 15 states, right? So a brilliant move on Jefferson's part to do that, right? Now in 1807, we have the federal ban on the slave trade. Now, This goes all the way back to the Continental Congress. During that time, 11 of the 13 colonies agreed that we should have a statement of condemnation against Britain for continuing the importation of slaves and being a participant in the slave trade in the colonies. 2 of those colonies said, no, we don't agree with that. And so because the declaration had to be unanimous, right, they opted to say, fine, since we can't get agreement here, what we will do is we will put a 20-year moratorium that on that after we pass the Constitution, that in 20 years, from the Declaration, 20 years from the Declaration, that we would be able to have a federal ban on slavery in our territories. The colonies agreed. And so as you're getting to this point, right, we wouldn't be able to do this until 1808. And so in 1806, right, Jefferson he wants to end this as eagerly as he can. He wants nothing to do with slavery, and we'll touch on that we'll touch on that. We're gonna be a little late, but we'll touch on that because that's important too. And so 1806, he's getting in front of Congress. He's saying, look, we are 2 years away from this thing. I need you guys to start now because I want to sign this. I want a bill on my desk so I can sign the end of the slave trade in America. So get on it now. So in 1806, he's pushing them. They get their acts together. By 1807, they're able to put the law forward, and he signs it in 1807 with the effective date being the first day of the year in 1808. So Jefferson was able to, on March 2nd, 1807, signs the ban on the federal ban on the slave trade, and it goes into effect on January 1st of 1808, making Jefferson the first leader of any major nation to sign a national ban on the slave trade. Right? Again, one of the arguments you hear about Jefferson is this idea that, oh, well, he was just like the founders, he was a slave owner. Well, where was Jefferson from? Virginia. What do we know about Virginia? One of the most difficult states, right, that had all these ridiculous laws as thick as like an IRS tax code when it came to slavery. In Jefferson's case, the law that was passed that allowed Washington to free his slaves on his death, they actually repealed. So Jefferson couldn't do that. So Jefferson couldn't free his slaves. So that law got changed in 1806, which removes that option entirely. So even though he couldn't free his own slaves, he was a very vocal abolitionist at the local level and at the national level. And it is well documented that he treated the slaves that he had were treated very well, that there was no negativity around because he hated this practice. In fact, I wish I was able to have the other book. But in the first book, what you don't typically find is that the declaration, the statement that they wanted to include in the Declaration of Independence was penned by Jefferson. It was one of the most forceful denunciations of slavery that you will find. Most people don't even know that that was written because it wasn't included because it had to be a unanimous consent document. But if you actually look at the history of the revisions, you will see Jefferson writing in no uncertain terms of how abhorrent he viewed slavery, how abhorrent Great Britain was for participating, and he actually capitalized the word men, double underlined in capitals in his resolution as he drafted it. So he vehemently opposed slavery. So to give you a quick rundown of history, it's going to be rapid fire dates, but just to give you a small sampling of Jefferson's advocacy for ending slavery. So in 1769, in his first term in the VA House, he puts forward an emancipation statute that would free all slaves in the Virginia territory. Of course, that gets defeated. 1770, he represents a slave in Virginia court arguing for his freedom, stating that, and I quote, "Under the law of nature, all men are born free." He'd lose that case. But in 1772, he would argue a similar case and win on the same principle. 1776, he would write a draft of the Virginia Constitution that stipulated slavery would be outlawed. Wasn't included in the final version, unfortunately. 1778, he introduces a Virginia bill to ban the importation of slaves into the state, which passes. So at least at a minimum, what he was trying to do is like, look, if we're going to have this ugly thing here, let's at least stop more ugliness from entering, right? That was the goal of what he was trying to do in 1778. 1779, as Virginia governor, he tries to emancipate, again, all the slaves, trying to put forward an act to emancipate all the slaves of Virginia. He's unable to do so because the other houses outmaneuver him and veto his ability to do that. 1784, in the Continental Congress, he introduces a provision to end slavery in every territory that would become part of the new nation. It loses by a single vote. 1787, the Continental Congress would adopt a revised version of Jefferson's 1784 proposal. And then in 1789, Congress would pass the Northwest Ordinance, which included Jefferson's anti-slavery proposal. As a result, the states of Minnesota, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin all enter the U.S. as free states. So Jefferson was not this person that celebrated slavery. He was not someone that championed slavery. All of the history tells us that he wanted to end this. In fact, we'll get to this during Madison's presidency. But by the time you get to the Missouri Compromise, Jefferson is 77 years old. He's one of the only founders at the time that's still alive. I'd have to double check if other founders were there. He was so pissed off at that whole passing of that law. He goes, we are committing national suicide by embracing this abhorrent practice in this country. 77-year-old Jefferson never changed his position on slavery. And so at the end of the day, like we're out of time, but because there's even more that I didn't even touch on the separation of church and state stuff because I did that in detail in the first class. So if you want to get the details there, find that class on YouTube from the first series, and I go into depth of what that entire thing was about and how it's completely been completely retconned into the wrong things today because it doesn't mean at all what it means in where it comes from, because it's not in any of the founding documents. It's actually in a letter that Madison sends to the Newbury Baptists of Connecticut. But if you want to chat with me after class, I can give you the story on that. But long story short, this is where Jefferson was. So Jefferson was a very successful president, and he had a lot of things that he did well, but he also was someone who, when you think about some of the things that happened in his era that we see today, we see some of those same sort of pulls, especially when we think about the decision for Marbury versus Madison, something that continues to show its head today. When we think about this idea of extremism and Islamic extremism in particular, it's not new. It was something that was happening even during Washington's day that Jefferson would end up dealing with. And so none of these things are new. To Jefferson's credit, he would appeal very closely to all four of the pillars that Washington would put forward, right? So again, the four pillars, just very quickly, to be a proud American and to work to preserve the national unity, to avoid intense partisanship and polarization, reject loyalty to party or group above loyalty to the nation and the Constitution, to keep American interests first and to avoid foreign entanglements. That was his goal by going against the Barbary nations in 1803. It's like, this is against our national interest. We need to end this so that we don't have to be entangled with them. And then lastly, this idea of don't let the government become secularist. I could give you a list of all the things that Jefferson did as president that co-signed public religious displays and actions at his presidency, at the Capitol, in other buildings, the fact that he would attend church every Sunday, that he would co-sign worship services in the Treasury area, in the War area. Like, there's so many that I could give you, but all of these things, like Jefferson was acutely aware of how important it was to be moored and anchored to these foundations. And you see that bear out in his presidency. And so I'll close here because we're way over time. Father in heaven, thank you again for this opportunity to go through these things. We thank you that we can see your hand in history and how you shape it. We thank you for the fact that you still are gracious and show mercy to this country in spite of our shortcomings. But we thank you that you still provide your blessings, that you still give us grace, and that we would pray that as we're educated in this class and we have the opportunity to know these things, that we could use them most importantly for the furtherance of the gospel, because the gospel and the gospel alone is what changes hearts and minds and turns people to a proper understanding of how they should act, not just with you, but with one another. And so we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.